5 years ago, a young man made the decision to pack up his life and move to South Dakota. It was the first time he had ever lived alone, and honestly, it was long overdue. His parents had been on his case for years about getting out of the house, and he finally caved. He was never much of a social butterfly, so the idea of living somewhere secluded actually appealed to him. The house he found was in one of the snowiest parts of the state, tucked away on a stretch of land where the nearest neighbor was a solid walk away. That was fine by him. For the most part, that is exactly what he got. The first few years were uneventful in the best way possible. He kept to himself, went to work, came home, and did not bother anyone. He never introduced himself to any of the neighbors, partly because he is just not that kind of person, and partly because there was not much of a compelling reason to do so. The houses out there are so spread apart that you could go weeks without seeing another soul. But everything changed one afternoon in early February. He was at work when the snow started coming down. At first it was nothing unusual, but within an hour it had escalated into something else entirely. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the roads started getting dangerous. His boss eventually told everyone to head home before conditions got any worse. He drove a lifted truck, so he was not too worried about making it back. He had driven through plenty of bad weather before, and the truck had always handled it well. Still, there were certain sections of the drive that had him a little concerned. By the time he finally pulled into his driveway, he was just relieved to be home. But when he went to unlock his front door, he realized it was frozen solid. He stood there for a second processing what was happening, then tried again, but it would not budge. He did not have a lighter on him, or anything else that could generate enough heat to thaw the mechanism. He tried breathing on it, cupping his hands around it, even banging on it a few times out of frustration. None of it worked. He walked back to his truck and sat there, not sure what to do. The heater was blasting, and he told himself he would just wait out the storm. Maybe it would die down in an hour or two, and he could figure something out. But as he sat there watching through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder. After maybe 10 minutes, he realized he was making a mistake. The longer he waited, the worse things were going to get. His truck was already half buried, and even with the lift, he doubted he would be able to get back out of the driveway. So now driving was not even an option anymore. He did not have anyone to call. He did not know any of his neighbors, and his parents were hours away. He tried to drive the truck out of there, but like he suspected, it was stuck. His only real option was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for help. He hated the idea of showing up at some stranger's door, asking them to take him in. But he did not have another choice. Staying in his truck all night was not going to work. The gas would eventually run out, and then he would be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. The closest house was still pretty far away, probably a quarter of a mile or so. By the time he reached it, he was shivering uncontrollably. It was a tiny one-story house, and even through the blowing snow, he could tell it was in rough shape. He knocked on the front door as loud as he could. He waited for a good minute and was just about to turn away and try the next house, when the door swung open so violently he actually took a step back. The man standing there looked around 50 years old with an extremely nondescript face. He looked at him for a second without saying anything, then introduced himself as Joe. The young man explained his situation, and Joe nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him in. He should have felt relieved, but something about Joe felt off from the start. It was hard to pinpoint at first. The house was warm, which was all he really cared about in the moment. Joe offered him a seat on the couch and sat across from him in a worn-out armchair. They made small talk for a few minutes, or at least he tried to. Joe answered his questions, but his attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His eyes kept darting around the room, from the young man to the floor to the ceiling to somewhere over his shoulder. It was like he could not focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. At first, he thought maybe Joe was just nervous about having a stranger in his house. That would have been understandable, but the longer they sat there, the more unsettled he became. Joe could not focus on the conversation either. He would be mid-sentence and then just trail off, staring at a spot on the wall like he was looking through it. He decided he wanted as little interaction with this guy as possible. He told Joe he was exhausted and asked if he could just get some sleep. Joe seemed almost relieved by the suggestion and pointed to the couch, saying he could crash there for the night. The young man asked if they could turn out the light, and Joe flicked off the lamp without argument. But he did not leave. He just stood there in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, not saying anything, not even moving. The young man lay on the couch with his eyes half closed, trying to look like he was already drifting off. Eventually, after this long, uncomfortable pause, Joe finally receded down the hallway toward what he assumed was his bedroom. He really did try to sleep. He was exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than he expected, but he could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every time he closed his eyes, he started to drift off and then jolt awake, convinced he heard something. About an hour in, he actually did start hearing things. It took him a few seconds to realize that the thumping and scraping sounds were coming from above him. At first, he told himself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time in heavy storms. But these sounds were different somehow. That did not make any sense, though. The house was one story. There was no upstairs floor for anyone to be walking around on. He lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself there was a rational explanation. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic but persistent. And then, without warning, there was a thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that he shot right up on the couch. And as soon as he sat up, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while just watching him in the dark, because he had not heard him come back. His skin started feeling itchy. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could get a word out, Joe literally charged at him. He jumped over the back of the couch and tackled him to the floor. The next few seconds were pure chaos. They rolled around on the carpet, and he realized Joe was trying to put him in a chokehold. Joe was stronger than he looked, and for a moment he thought he was not going to be able to get him off. He kept resisting, and Joe started yelling. He screamed at him to stop fighting. He kept referencing this other person, saying she was lonely and how she would find him to be good company. He was not thinking about that, though. He was fighting for his life. He finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him off. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his coat, and ran for the front door. He did not even put his coat on. He was too terrified to waste any more time. Behind him, he heard that crazy scream echo. He was pretty sure Joe said that she was not going to be happy at all, or some insane threat along those lines. He ran and did not stop until he reached the next house. The family who answered the door were normal people, a husband and wife. They took one look at him and pulled him inside without asking questions. He slept on their couch that night. The next morning, he woke up to the wife, who introduced herself as Kathy. She was making everyone coffee. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and he told them what had happened. As soon as he described the house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted him. He asked if it was Joe. The young man said yes, and Brandon just nodded like he was not surprised at all. He told him that Joe had been a problem in the area for years, but then he told him something that gave his skin that itchy feeling again. About a decade earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. There was never any official investigation. Nothing was ever proven, but most people in the area suspected he killed her. The body was never found. The young man immediately connected the dots, but kept his mouth shut for whatever reason. He still has no idea why he did not speak up. He did end up reporting his experience to the police, but he does not think they ever did anything to deal with it. The scariest part is that he still lives in the same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that night in the blizzard, but he would be lying if he said he does not get a weird feeling every time he drives past Joe's house. The one silver lining to all this is that he got close with the family who took him in, but he always gets a weird feeling every time he goes over there, because it reminds him of Joe and whatever god-awful thing he did to his wife. This second incident happened last winter, during one of the worst blizzards the region can remember. The protagonist is 27 years old and lives alone in a small rental house in upstate New York. He works remotely in finance, which sounds fancier than it is. Mostly, he just sits at his desk and stares at spreadsheets all day. The point is, he rarely has a reason to leave the house during the week. Some weeks he does not leave at all. Anyway, the local news had been hyping up this blizzard for days. Every storm is potentially historic or life-threatening until it dumps 3 inches and everyone moves on. But this one actually looked serious. The weather alerts were telling people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary, stock up on essentials, all of that. So he went grocery shopping that morning, grabbing enough food to last him through the weekend, and then he settled in for what he assumed would be a boring few days of working from home. The snow started in the mid-afternoon, and by around 8 in the evening, he could barely see past his front porch. He spent most of the evening on his couch, half watching TV and half listening to the wind howl outside. It is a specific kind of sound, wind during a blizzard. It is not like a summer storm where it comes and goes in gusts. This was constant, like the house was inside a giant wind tunnel. At around 10:30, he heard a new sound. It was kind of like a loud thud, followed by a dragging sound, sort of like something heavy being pulled across wood. He figured a tree branch had come down. There are a few old oaks near his driveway, and with all that snow and wind, it would not be surprising if one of them dropped a limb. About 15 minutes later, though, he heard a car horn. It was not a normal honk. It was weak and intermittent, almost like someone had tapped the horn on accident. He went to his front window and looked out. There was a vehicle stopped near the end of his driveway. He could see its headlights cutting through the snow, but that was about it. He stood there for a few minutes waiting to see if anyone would get out, but he could not make out any movement. With the storm the way it was, he could not even tell what kind of car it was. His first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. It sounds callous, but he was not about to trudge out into a blizzard to check on a stranger. Not when he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He went back to the couch and tried to focus on something else. At around 11, he heard knocking at his front door. He did not open the door. Instead, he walked over and called out, asking who was there. A man's voice answered. He said his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, like he was out of breath. Part of him felt guilty. If this guy really had been walking through that storm, he probably was freezing. But another part of him still was not fully ready to just open his door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Instead of opening the door fully, he cracked it. He made sure to keep the security chain locked. The man on his porch was covered in snow, like to a laughable extent. It was caked on his jacket, his shoulders, his hair. He was shorter than him, and he was visibly shivering. The man said his phone had died, and that he had been walking for some time trying to find a house with lights on. He was just about to open the door when he noticed his boots. He does not know what made him look down, but he did. And here is the thing. His boots were clean. They were clean and dry, too. If this guy had really been walking through a blizzard for any length of time, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice as well. His own boots get like that, just walking to his car. He felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He told him again that he would call for help and make sure someone came for him. The man asked to be let in again, more firmly this time. The homeowner did not respond. He just closed the door and locked it. He could hear him say something on the other side, but he was already walking to get his phone. He called 911 and explained the situation. While he was on the line with the operator, he heard footsteps move from his porch to the side of his house toward the back. The operator told him to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. She said police were being dispatched, but warned him that response times might be delayed because of the weather. He moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting the man to see him. The man was standing near the corner of his house, maybe 15 feet away. He was not moving. He was just standing there looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, he heard banging on his back door, like someone was trying to break through. The whole door was shaking in its frame. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to his bedroom. He locked the door behind him and stood a few feet from the door. The bang stopped after maybe a minute. He does not know how long he stood there. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. At some point, he heard the car horn again, the same one from earlier, but this time it was one long continuous honk. Luckily, the police arrived shortly after that. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where he had seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here is the part that still gets him. The officers told him there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to his house. Apparently, the snow was undisturbed between the car and his property. There were footsteps leading down his driveway and around his house, but they stopped at the driveway like someone had been driving a separate car. The police searched the area, but did not find anyone. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the sun was out, he went outside to look around. To his horror, there were muddy handprints on the exterior of his bedroom window, which definitely had not been there when the police searched the property. It was like the person had come back after they had left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, he found out that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The homeowner was not there, so no one was hurt, but absolutely nothing was stolen. This third story happened several years ago now. He has told maybe 3 people about it. His wife, his brother, and one close friend who he knew would not think he was losing his mind. He is telling it here because he still does not have an explanation. And at this point, he has accepted that he probably never will. He is 34 years old and lives in British Columbia. For most of his 20s, he was a professional skier, alpine racing mostly. He competed nationally for about 6 years before his body started telling him it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic like a career-ending injury, just the accumulation of wear and tear that happens when you have been throwing yourself down mountains since you were a kid. He stepped away from competition when he was 26, which felt like the right call at the time and still does. But retiring from competitive skiing does not mean you stop skiing. If anything, it freed him up to do the kind of skiing he actually loved, backcountry stuff away from the resorts and crowds. He says all this not to brag, but to establish that he knew what he was doing out there. He was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and familiar with every protocol you are supposed to follow when you are skiing alone in remote terrain. He had done dozens of solo trips in the backcountry without incident. The plan that day was simple. He was going to hit a remote range a few hours north of where he lived, a spot he had skied before. The weather forecast was calling for light snowfall, maybe a few inches, but nothing that would prevent a day trip. He checked the avalanche conditions the night before and again that morning. Everything looked manageable. He got to the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on his gear, and started skinning uphill. The snowfall started picking up while he was climbing, which was not unusual, but the wind had changed too. It was coming from a different direction than the forecast had predicted, and it was stronger than it should have been. Visibility was also dropping much faster than he was comfortable with. The smart move would have been to just turn around immediately. But he was already at the top of a line he had been looking forward to all week. He told himself just one run, and then he would call it early. He has replayed that decision 1,000 times since then, and before you say it, yes, he knew it was incredibly stupid. He knows experienced people die all the time in the backcountry because they make exactly the kind of call he made that day. He knew it then too, but he did it anyway. The descent started fine, the pitch was manageable, and he was skiing conservatively just to be extra safe. About 2/3 of the way down the mountain, though, the worst possible thing happened. If you have never been caught in an avalanche, it is hard to describe how fast it happens. One second you are in control, the next you are just not. It is not the same thing as wiping out or even catching an edge. The snow moves and you have no choice but to move with it. He got lucky. The avalanche was not big. Probably a Class 2, which was enough to knock him off his skis, but not enough to bury him. He tumbled maybe 30 or 40 yards before he slammed into something solid. Slammed as in an instant deceleration. He does not even know what it was. Rocks probably, or maybe a tree buried under the snowpack. But all he remembers in that moment was the feeling in his left leg. He remembers just lying there trying to convince himself everything was all right, But it was not. His skis had released. That was good. That is what they were supposed to do. But one of them had tumbled further downhill, and he had no idea where it ended up. He tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The pain in his leg was unimaginable. He managed to get himself into a sitting position and took stock of the situation. The snow was still getting worse too, which meant he was likely in the opening moments of a blizzard. But the worst part was obviously his leg. He could not put much weight on it, which meant he could not ski out even if he found his other ski. His options were limited. He had 3 choices. 2 of them were suicide, and the third was not much better. He could stay where he was and hope someone came looking for him, but only one person knew where he was that day, and he would not have assumed something was wrong for at least a few hours. He could try to dig and wait out the storm, but he did not have the supplies for an overnight, and the temperature was dropping. Or he could start moving painfully and slowly to try and cover as much ground as possible before conditions got even worse. He chose to move. It was not like he had much of a choice. He secured what was left of his gear and started limping downhill, using the one pole that was miraculously still in his hand as a makeshift crutch. Every step sent agony through his leg, but he had to keep moving. As for the snow, his prediction turned out to be correct. It only got worse, and at that point, it was falling so heavily that he could barely see. He was ignoring the pain in his leg, focusing on moving as fast as he could, and wondering whether he was going to die out there when he heard something behind him. At first, he thought the adrenaline was finally getting to his head and overwhelming his brain. That was genuinely his first thought, that he was becoming delirious in his final moments before passing out. But he turned around anyway, and what he saw made him feel incredibly strange. There was another skier moving downhill toward him. He cannot describe it, but seeing him emerging from the snow filled him with an emotion that has no word. He was skeptical as to whether what he was seeing was even real, simultaneously relieved and terrified. It was fear, but for what he did not know, the stranger reached him within a few minutes. He was alone and backcountry equipped. He pulled off his helmet to readjust his goggles and asked if he was hurt. The injured skier explained what happened. Without wasting a second, the stranger moved up to his side and let him put his arm around his shoulder. They started moving together, and he felt something that he could not explain. There was something beyond the adrenaline, pain, relief, and confusion. It did not feel like a normal interaction. It felt like he had not stumbled upon him by accident, as crazy as that sounds. They talked about basic stuff, most of which he does not remember. But there was one thing he said that stayed with him. He told him he had not used his legs in a long time, and it was nice to get back on solid ground. He did not really know what he meant by that. He assumed he was talking in some ski jargon he did not know. He laughed softly and they kept going. At one point he had to stop. He remembers this exact moment like it was yesterday. He leaned against a tree and closed eyes for literally 4 seconds, and when he opened them, the stranger was gone. There was no one there, but unless he buried himself in the snow, there was really nowhere for anyone to go either. He yelled for him. What else was he going to do? But no one called back. He started looking at the snow in the immediate area, thinking maybe he had gotten buried. Nothing. It gets worse, though. There were no tracks in the snow other than his own. He started freaking out. The stranger had been right there, right next to him, supporting half his weight for what must have been like an hour. But there was nothing. He started feeling dizzy, like someone had just punched him in the gut. And the feeling he had been feeling earlier came back. The rational part of his brain was insisting there had to be an explanation. Could he have been more disoriented than he thought? Maybe the snow had filled in his tracks faster than his own. Or maybe he had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe he was already dead. He did not have time to figure it out. The storm was not going to wait for him to process what had happened. He does not know how he made it back to his car. The last mile or so was such a blur, just pain and cold and the stubborn refusal to stop moving. But he did eventually make it. He drove himself to the hospital and finally got some good news. The doctor told him his leg was severely sprained but not broken. They told him he got incredibly lucky. Fast forward to a few days later and he is still recovering at home. But he cannot stop thinking about one thing, That other skier, where he had come from, where he had gone, why there had not been any tracks. He kept telling himself he would figure it out eventually, but he thinks that was mostly wishful thinking. He was combing through some local skier website, something he does often, and that is when he stumbled upon something terrifying. It was a story about a fatal backcountry skiing incident. A man who had been lost in a storm a few weeks prior. It had happened on the same mountain range, and authorities had not been able to find a body. The worst had been assumed. There were no photographs of the man in the article, and when he searched up his name, he did not find any social media profiles or anything of the nature, so he cannot compare them. But it is still a chilling coincidence. These stories of winter survival remind one that the coldest months can hide the most terrifying dangers, leaving behind memories that will haunt these three men for the rest of their lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.